The Boston Massacre was an event that further stagnated and separated the relationship between the colonists and the British. This confrontation allowed the colonies to rally and unite together against the actions and policies placed by the British government. It was an event that also contributed to the American Revolution that happened from 1775 to 1783. The Boston Massacre was caused by the buildup of resentment the colonists had for the British. This resentment mostly stemmed from the multiple taxes implemented by the British government in order to collect money to fund things such as war and military supplies. War was very costly and expensive, and the British used taxes as a way to pay for it. However, the British Parliament decided these actions alone and did not consider the voices of the colonists. The excessive taxing of the colonists by the British government did not ask the consent of the colonists themselves, and coined the popular term, "no taxation without representation." This term showed the colonists' dissatisfaction with the British Parliament. They did not have an elected representative that helped voice the colonists' view on deciding factors such as the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts placed taxes on glass, paint, oil, lead, paper, and tea so that the government could collect the revenue they needed. Soldiers were stationed in Boston in order to enforce these policies and also protect and support the custom commissioners. Around 4,000 British troops were dispatched in Boston in 1768. This was a lot considering that the population of Boston at the time was only about 20,000 people. This not only arose more tension between the colonists and soldiers, but it also emphasized the hostility between the British and colonists in general. Despite the popular depictions of the Boston Massacre, the event was not accurately portrayed but rather represented a political statement in the colonist perspective. The mortality rate was very low, about only 5 people died, but the event was still described as a bloody massacre. This video shows a reenactment of the Boston Massacre and lists the people who died during the event.
Silversmith and political radical Paul Revere captures the moment British soldiers kill 5 colonists in the streets of Boston. His engraving will fuel the fires of revolution as outrage spreads across the 13 colonies. March 5th, 1770. After 3 days of unrest, an angry mob roams the streets. Hundreds of men who lost their jobs and blame the British gather on King Street and face off against 8 redcoats with orders not to fire. What's about to happen will change America forever. A 17-year-old wigmaker's apprentice, Edward Garrick, lights the fuse. This is how wars start. Private Hugh Montgomery is hit with a club. An African-American, Crispus Attucks, dies instantly. When the smoke clears, 4 more are dead.
Unhappy Boston, see thy sons deplore, thy hallowed walks besmeared with guiltless gore, whilst faithless Preston and his savage bands, with murderous rancor, stretch their bloody hands.
The most formidable army in the world, firing on an unarmed crowd. An explosive image with a title that says it all.
However, this does not show how the Boston Massacre really started and instead emphasizes the violence that occurred after the initial misunderstanding in the beginning. It was a snowy night and an argument between a colonist and a soldier had escalated into a crowd. A mob had formed as the crowd grew. The colonists were pelting the soldier with snowballs and attacking him with insults. Supposedly, when 7 soldiers tried to come to their allies' aid, one of them fell over with all the chaos that was happening. The fall led to the soldier accidentally yelling fire, which led the others in mistaking it as a command to fire on the crowd. Some say it wasn't the word fire that was yelled in response, but the actual gunshot that was heard as he hit the ground. However, both the soldiers and the colonists were filled with fear, and the tension in the air had emotions running high. This could have led to how chaotic the event turned out. None of the 5 people that died were soldiers, and one of the most well-known victims was Crispus Attucks. He was a runaway slave that was known as the first casualty of the Boston Massacre. However, all the people who fell to death to the events of the Boston Massacre were generally honored as the first casualties of the American Revolution. They were buried at the Granary Burying Ground in Boston. A few of the soldiers were injured, but it was not as heavy compared to the injuries and casualties of the colonist side. Another interpretation is the iconic image created by Paul Revere. In the image, you can see that the soldiers took all the initiative to gun down the mob of colonists while the colonists were cowering in fear. You can also see that a few of the colonists drawn in the picture are also dead or wounded. The dead man on the floor is supposedly Crispus Attucks, even though Paul Revere whitewashed him as a white colonist. A wounded man is seen receiving help from other nearby colonists as the soldiers continue to fire ammunition without mercy. Although the Boston Massacre took place on a snowy night, there is no snow shown in the picture. The only indication of the night is a small moon in the corner of the blue sky. It also does not show the wounded soldiers that had received damage during the Boston Massacre and shows how biased and opinionated Paul Revere's depiction of the event really is. His image was more of a propaganda against the British rather than an actual representation of the Boston Massacre. Despite the inaccuracy of the interpreted event of the Boston Massacre, this helped spread an anti-British idea amongst the residents. It advocated for the innocence of the colonists while the soldiers were seen as ruthless people who had taken part in manslaughter. It depicted the event as soldiers taking aim at innocent colonists who were not armed with any weapons and using unnecessary force against them. It did not consider the attempt the colonists took in provoking the soldiers with snowballs and insults, and instead blamed the soldiers for taking advantage of their weapons. As the news of the Boston Massacre spread throughout the other colonies, it angered the colonists even more. The number of protests and physical acts of opposition against the British increased after the Boston Massacre occurred. The Boston Massacre was only a public act of how displeased the colonists were, but the main goal of what the colonists wanted was self-government. They didn't like how controlling the British Parliament was, especially on the taxes, and how they had no say in the decisions that would affect them the most. They wanted to be able to have some control over things such as trade. The British withdrew their stationed soldiers in order to avoid bigger conflicts involving the colonists after the Boston Massacre ended. For the time being, the British had decided to back down. The Townshend Act was repealed, and for about 3 years, peace was restored after the Boston Massacre from 1770 to 1772. The Currency Act was also put into discussion by Parliament and was finally repealed around 1774 as well. This was the result that gave the colonists hope that if enough action was taken, they could go against the British government in order to achieve what they wanted. The Boston Massacre allowed the colonists to witness their own capabilities and their impact on the British if they all united under a common cause. The conflict also emphasized the need and demand for independence between the colonists and the British. It fueled more actions for the colonists in an attempt to gain power and self-governance, and led to the peak event of the American Revolution that represented the tug-of-war of power between colonists and the British.
The end. Goodbye.